Hola, muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos a todos. Eh, Les agradezco el que hayan tenido el tiempo de participar en esta Extension Talk que hemos organizado desde UCAV Chile, donde hoy día hablaremos de recargas de acuíferos, ¿ya? Me presento, yo soy Mauricio Cañoles, el gerente general de UCAV Chile, del Centro de Excelencia Internacional. Y bueno, este seminario se enmarca, esta Extension Talk se enmarca una serie de workshops, seminarios que hemos armado desde nuestra área de comunicaciones, tratando de acercar el conocimiento y la experiencia de California a nuestro país, a Chile, y pudiendo compartir las experiencias técnicas, tecnológicas, también con las autoridades, con técnicos chilenos, con la gente que está hoy día puntualmente en el tema de agua. Hoy día vamos a contar con la participación de la doctora Helen Dahlke, que es profesora del Departamento de Land and Water en UC Davis en California. Posteriormente tendremos un panel, el cual será moderado por el profesor José Luis Arumi, de la Universidad de Concepción, y miembro directivo del Centro del CRIAM, también de la Universidad de Concepción. Dentro de este panel participarán el señor Federico Errázuri, secretario ejecutivo de la Comisión Nacional de Riego, y don Oscar Cristi, director general de la Dirección General de Aguas. Como les decía, estas Extension Talks que hemos llamado desde UC Davis obedecen al poder transferir, al poder compartir experiencia desde California a Chile, y también poder compartir no solo con los usuarios del agua, con la gente que finalmente está trabajando en esto, sino también con el sector académico. Y es así que aprovecho también de enmarcar esta actividad dentro de las primeras actividades también que estamos haciendo en el recientemente adjudicado Consorcio Tecnológico del Agua de la macrozona Centro-Sur, que se adjudicó la semana pasada y fue el lanzamiento oficial de la adjudicación por parte de Corfo, de lo cual también estamos muy agradecidos por la confianza que las autoridades, que Corfo y los distintos ministerios han puesto en este consorcio y en el trabajo que desde UCAV Chile con nuestros socios académicos, en este caso en la Universidad de Concepción muy de cerca, quien lidera este consorcio, la Universidad Católica, la Universidad Bernardo Higgins, el INIA, el Instituto Nacional de Investigaciones del Ministerio de Agricultura, la Universidad Diego Portales, la Universidad, ya la mencioné, Bernardo Higgins, pero muy especialmente también con todas las autoridades que estarán vinculadas a esta iniciativa futuro, desde el Ministerio de Obras Públicas, el Ministerio de Agricultura, el Ministerio del Medio Ambiente, etc. Sin más preámbulo, dejo con ustedes a la doctora Helen Dahlke para que nos haga una presentación sobre recarga de acuíferos en California. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Mauricio and Leticia, for inviting me. Can everyone hear me okay and see me?
Yes, everything is fine.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And let's see, it seems to be working. Okay. So yeah, again, thank you for the invitation. I was invited to talk about some of the research that my lab is working on here in California. And this is particularly on agricultural managed aquifer recharge, which is a form of managed aquifer recharge. You might be more familiar with other forms such as recharging groundwater through infiltration basins, or ASR, which stands for aquifer storage and recharge, where we use groundwater wells. We inject water directly into the groundwater aquifer and then pump it out later when we need it. But in recent years here in California, this form of MAR has emerged basically due to a combination of several factors. One being mainly that we have a lot of agricultural land, particularly in the Central Valley, that we can make use of. And it's connected to irrigation systems that can convey water to various places. And it is also a combination of climate. So in the next 45 minutes, I'm planning to cover various aspects of this agricultural managed aquifer recharge. But to start with a little bit of a background, this map here is showing 37 of the largest groundwater aquifers that we have across the globe. And different colors indicate different levels of groundwater overdraft or stress that these aquifers are experiencing. And yeah, as of publication of this map here, which was published in 2015, about 13 of the 37 aquifers that you can see here were classified as being critically overdrafted and in a condition that we would describe as having crossed a critical threshold of return. So there is really concern that these aquifers might never be restored to the level that they had before, you know, humans started pumping groundwater. And you can see number 16 here, that's the Centro Valley Alluvial Aquifer, the one that we will be focusing on here in the coming slides. So yeah, using various methods, we have estimated that about 160 million acre feet of groundwater have been pumped out of the Central Valley alluvial aquifers over the last 100 years. 1 million acre feet is about 1.2 cubic kilometers. So you can potentially do the conversion in your head. We're talking about 1.3 times roughly the size or the volume of Lake Tahoe, which is a very big lake here in California. We also had recently a fairly extensive drought from 2012 to 2016. And in 2014, the state legislature of California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which sort of started this process to really take action, on the ground action to address this groundwater overdraft. And so now all overlying landowners in California are asked to put together plans to bring these groundwater basins back into balance by 2040 or 2042, depending on what state your groundwater basin is. Some of them are critically overdrafted. Most of them are located here in the Tulare Lake Basin and San Joaquin Valley. Overall, all groundwater basins in the Central Valley basically have to develop a plan in the coming years. And this plan will also have to address potential climate change impacts that we are facing in the coming decades. California, similarly to Chile, has a Mediterranean climate, which means we often get a rainy season and then we have a dry summer season. And here in California, we also grapple quite a bit with interannual variability in precipitation. And this is really well shown here in the center graph, which shows the cumulative precipitation from different water years. The light blue shaded area is the long-term average, 1966 to 2015. And then you can see here the driest year on record and the wettest year on record. And so in the driest year, we sometimes, we have received less than half of the annual precipitation that we typically get. And then in wet years, which, do not occur too often, maybe once every 10 or 20 years, we can get, almost 200% of typical precipitation, which can even create quite a bit of flooding and quite a bit of economic damage to the state. So managed aquifer recharge is really a technology that the state is more and more looking at because it can solve multiple problems. It can help with flood mitigation, so particularly in those areas that might be prone to flooding, where we might see rivers exceeding their banks, flooding highways, creating damage. If we divert that water onto managed lands for groundwater recharge, we might prevent rivers downstream from overflowing their banks. But it can also help with water storage in general. So as climate change is unfolding, there's the expectation that our surface water reservoirs will not be able to handle these flows, which are expected to increase in magnitude. And so finding a different way of storing water in the long term, underground particularly, is really a plus that many see as a long-term solution to the groundwater or the water storage problem in general. So my lab has actually looked into the availability of surface water for groundwater recharge. And as many of you might know, most surface water in the state is already allocated, at least on paper, meaning that various end users like water districts or private landowners might have water rights. They have already applied for water rights. They have a certain amount allocated that they can use every year. So on average, there's really not much water that we have left in the system that we can use for recharge. But the one source that we do see flowing by on a regular basis are these like storm flows or flood flows. So these high flow peaks during big storm events, which we call high magnitude flows. And so here in this study, we've looked into a statistical analysis of long-term stream flow data. We have selected the 90th percentile. So just looking at the 10% largest flows on the record. And we've looked how much water is in those flows, because often they actually cannot be stored in reservoirs. You often see surface reservoirs making flood releases in the winter in response to these big flow events. And often that water just flows out to the ocean and is, as we would call it, underutilized. So in this study, we estimated that about 1 to 2 million acre feet are on average available over the 3 or 6 months winter period in the Sacramento Valley. So with the bigger bluer dots here in this graph. And up to 1 million acre feet can be available actually in the San Joaquin Valley, which is the lower 2/3 of the Central Valley. But again, flow availability varies from location to location. And so, there's not really an overall answer to say, we have lots of water available everywhere. And this is probably more than a management question or a question of how can we move water around to those areas that need it the most. Yeah, so as already hinted on, flooding agricultural fields for groundwater recharge opens up really a lot of questions. And I've given multiple talks at grower meetings here in the Central Valley. And I'm always interested to hear about the concerns that growers have, because we're talking about flooding fields that are in agricultural production. May they be planted with annual crops that, which could mean the fields are fallow in the winter, but it can also mean flooding fields that are planted with perennial crops like almonds or alfalfa or pistachios or walnuts or wine grapes, for example. So there are really different aspects that we're investigating, ranging from, how tolerant are crops, different cropping systems to the extra water in the winter. What are suitable locations that we can recommend for implementing these MAR projects? How does the recharge influence water quality? Every field that is under production often receives some sort of chemical input, may it be fertilizers or pesticides. The question is really what happens to those chemicals as we apply lots of water. And there are also, as already mentioned, questions about water availability at certain locations. We also wonder, where does the water go when we apply it at the land surface? And then there are many institutional and legal questions that might, be unique to California, but might also translate to other regions in the world. So I'm going to start with some of the research that we've done on crop suitability, because that is really the main concern of most growers. It's a question of risk. Are you willing to risk damaging your crops by recharging water in the winter, adding lots more water to your field that might impact potentially, yield or plant health during the growing season? And yeah, so I'm not the only one who has started looking at this. So some of the first experiments that were done on this were actually done by a consultant, Phil Bichon from Bichon and Associates. And he worked with one of the pioneers that we have here in the state, Don Cameron. He's the general manager of Terra Nova Farm. And he flooded several fields starting in 2011 for weeks and weeks. You can see here a picture of wine grapes flooded in the middle of June, you know, completely leafed out. And his neighbors call him crazy, but he is in an area of the Central Valley where he has no surface water access unless they get flood water. So, but he does not get normal surface water during the growing season. And so the groundwater pumper only area, and he has seen his groundwater levels drop by about a foot every year, and is very concerned, you know, about the long-term groundwater supply for his farm business. So, and that kind of got the research started, and but really not much is known about how different crops respond to flooding, particularly if it's continuous, like lasting several days to weeks. And some of the ones that seem to be looking okay are, for example, almonds, wine grapes, and pears that have a certain rootstock. But we were interested in looking into this a little bit more in detail. And for those of you who work directly with growers, the concern of flooding continuously fields that have crops grown or trees grown is that we create anaerobic conditions or anoxic actually conditions in the root zone, and this can really impact root growth, root production, which in the long term can have a negative impact on yield. It can increase the risk of seeing root diseases or plant pests, particularly fungi might develop, or mildew. It definitely can negatively impact nutrient and herbicide leaching, meaning that particularly if we have a lot of water standing on the field, the head is enough to push a lot of these soluble chemicals further down in the unsaturated zone. But it can also have very practical implications, such as affecting field operation. Often you have to wait a couple days after you stop applying water on the field for recharge until the field has dried out before you can go in with machinery to maybe apply fungicides. And by the time when it's dry, it might already be maybe too late, for example. So those are all concerns we are interested in learning more about. And just one more note here on the oxygen depletion that often happens if you apply water. You're basically sealing the soil surface, so you can't really have air entering the soil any longer from above. And then microbes often consume oxygen, which creates that depletion over time. But even if you stop applying water, it often takes hours to days until air can actually re-enter the soil, and that depends a little bit on what kind of soil texture you have. So one has to carefully consider for how long to apply the water to really make sure we're not reaching these anoxic conditions that can have potentially damaging effects. So some of the experiments that we have done have been conducted on alfalfa and almonds. We have had 2 experiments on alfalfa. One was here in Northern California in the Scott Valley, more a cooler mountain climate, and then one was here in Davis. On those, in those locations, particularly in the Scott Valley, we had a gravelly loam, really high percentage of rock fragments, and the infiltration rates of those soils were just outstanding. We could recharge up to 26 acre-feet per acre, so 26 standing feet of water in about 30 days. So really huge amounts of water that can go into the soil. We could see an immediate response in the water table, so really encouraging results. And we saw very little difference in yield between the plot that received the most water and our control. So alfalfa definitely, particularly if it's a variety that might go dormant in the winter, seems to be a very good candidate for doing on-farm recharge in the winter. We've also worked with private landowners to flood some almond orchards. Here we had 2 sites in Modesto and Dahlke in the San Joaquin Valley. And you can see here one of the pictures. In this test, we worked with the California Almond Board, and we applied a more moderate amount, so only 2 acre-feet per acre, just to see how the almonds were responding. And you can see here at the bottom a graph of just, you know, a general description of the residence time of the water in the soil. So Modesto had the finer textured soil. It took up to 48, 72 hours for the applied floodwater to drain through the root zone. The other side was really a pure sand. It only took 6 hours for the water to go through and disappear. So really, soil hydraulic properties play a huge role, but we were mainly interested in those studies to see how the trees were responding. So we took, for example, stem water potential measurements. You can see here the grower standard, the recharge treatment that received the 2 acre-feet per acre water in the winter, and the baseline. And so really for the Modesto side, the finer textured soil, there's not really any difference between those treatments. But in the sandy soil at Dahlke, we definitely saw that the trees stayed more hydrated as a result of the winter recharge compared to just a normal standard practice where you might get, you know, normal or below average precipitation in the winter. Nevertheless, yield did not seem to be impacted all that much. In Dahlke, we actually saw a positive response in yield to the recharge treatment. So more water here definitely resulted in more yield. At Modesto, there was not really much of a difference. 2017 was a wet year, a very wet year. So where we received 200% of normal precipitation. So here, the 2 extra feet of water that we applied for recharge might have been a little bit too much. We also looked at, this is work from my colleague Astrid Folder here in the Plant Sciences Department. She is a root specialist. And so she was looking into root production and root lifespan in these almond orchards. And you can see here in these plots, the upper plots show the total length of new roots produced over time. You have the 2 years for which we did experiments, 2016, 2017. And then the bottom graphs show the total length of dead roots in meter per meter squared. And looking at these plots, we can clearly see that at the finer textured soil side, the trees in the flood treatment seem to grow more new roots than in the control. In Dahlke, we kind of saw the opposite. Almond trees produce new roots all the time, and the more new roots they produce, the better they actually do. It definitely is a sign that your tree is healthy. And the other observation we made was that actually in the flood treatment here, the black bars, we did definitely see, we saw less dead roots being produced in the flood treatment, which was indicating that roots in general had a longer lifespan. So they were longer active and could, you know, participate, for example, in water or nutrient uptake. We also looked at nitrate leaching, since that is really one of the main concerns that growers have. California groundwater is already facing contamination issues from particularly with nitrate from fertilizer inputs. So we definitely want to know how much we are contributing if we apply lots of water on agricultural fields. And again, here, these graphs show the total nitrate load in kilograms per hectare For the root zone, which is the upper 3 feet, we drilled soil cores to about 4-meter depth in each orchard. And you can see here the different colors. We took cores before the winter recharge in blue and after the winter recharge in orange. And not too surprising, in the sandy side, we leached most of the residual nitrate that was present in the root zone. You can really see small bars here in orange. At Modesto, though, we did actually see an increase in nitrate after the recharge. And here we speculate that this was mainly due to mineralization of organic nitrogen, because we increased the moisture content in the root zone, and with that stimulated microbial communities that mineralize these the organic nitrogen into inorganic forms such as nitrate. So, you know, just some percentages here. These are the same plots, but for the full profile, so the full 16 feet cores that we took from each site. And you can see that there is also quite a bit of variability even just within the same field, which can be due to irrigation non-uniformity or, you know, non-uniformity when fertilizer was applied. Could also be due to lateral transport when we flooded the fields, that you know, lateral flow was moving certain you know, solutes to other areas within the orchard. So really can have multiple reasons why we see such a large diversity. Yeah, and that is actually currently a big question that one of my PhD students is investigating, Nick Murphy. So we're actually in the process right now building a hydrous model coupled, a 1D hydrous model coupled with the Freaksy code, which is a biogeochemical modeling code developed by the USGS. So we're looking into building all these nitrogen transformation processes into a hydrous model to better capture some of these nitrogen cycling processes, such as the mineralization of organic nitrogen into nitrate. So just to evaluate a little bit better, you know, how different soil types in combination with different crop types or management practices, irrigation practices might influence the residual nitrate load that we've left in the root zone before we start flooding, and, you know, even how it influences the nitrate load after the flooding going into the growing season. Because there are questions, you know, let's say we have lots of mineralization occurring in the root zone, which can produce substantial amounts of nitrate, then maybe we should adjust our fertilizer need and actually decrease the amount of fertilizer that is applied during the growing season, because we have already more in the system that we can make use of. In sandy soils, on the other hand, or let's say if we do continuous flooding where we do leach a lot of nitrate out of the root zone, we might instead actually have to adjust our fertilizer need up during the growing season, in case, you know, the root zone is completely scrubbed clean of, you know, any nitrate that might be available for plant uptake. So again, these are some trade-off questions we are interested in looking more deeply into, and we also are collaborating with soil microbiologists here at LAWR to look a little bit into the microbial communities and how they are changing under various conditions if we flood in the winter. We've also done other studies on alfalfa. These are results actually from the Kearney Research and Extension Center near Parlier, south of Fresno. Here in this study, we were interested in looking at how alfalfa varieties that actually do not go dormant might respond to winter flooding. So the southern Central Valley is warm enough that we don't really see alfalfa go dormant. It might slow down a little bit in growth, but it's definitely not reaching a dormancy state. And so here we tested, again, different water application amounts and timings. So you can see here these orange bars. So we applied water for 3 days continuously. And then we gave 4 days of rest where the soil profile could drain. And then we repeated the same for about 6 weeks. You can see here the blue line is the oxygen content of the soil, and you can see how it's progressively going down. So we clearly see oxygen depletion happening, and towards the end, we even reach anoxic conditions that could be damaging to yield and crop health. We recharged at this site almost 12 acre feet per acre, so that's probably yeah, almost double of what the growing season water demand is of this crop. Again, no response in yield, so biomass production really was not influenced by our winter recharge, but we did see a decline in the alfalfa feed quality. So as many of you probably know, alfalfa is grown because it's an essential feed for dairy cows or the dairy industry in general. And so alfalfa feed quality not only impacts the price that you will get for your alfalfa per ton, but it also affects, you know, again, the nutrition of your dairy cows. And so here we saw that, for example, the digestible fiber content definitely went down. So meaning that the alfalfa was less, had less useful fiber for the cows. The protein content didn't really change, but the digestible fiber content is definitely one of the important parameters that you want to see high if you want to have high quality alfalfa. So yeah, that's ongoing research that we still work on together also with the dairy industry in California, because again, alfalfa is a good candidate for winter recharge because it's a nitrogen fixing plant. Does not need much nitrogen or really no nitrogen fertilizer. And because of that, it would be a good candidate for clean recharge. So reducing the risk of moving more nitrate or chemicals into the groundwater. Yeah, so just to summarize a couple of those crop suitability points before I move on to my next couple slides. So really, we did not really see significant effects on yield, but alfalfa feed quality definitely seemed to be suffering if we do apply lots of water on alfalfa in the winter. And this is often related to creating anoxic conditions with the flooding. So one really needs to keep an eye on the oxygen status in the soil. And another side effect we saw, particularly in the alfalfa, was that we actually did have more weeds growing in those plots that received winter recharge, just because, again, you increase the moisture, and any moisture you provide, weeds will strive on. So they're, you know, opportunists. So next I wanted to move on to some of the groundwater modeling that we've done. And so one of the questions we often get is, you know, what is the large scale effect of doing this recharge on agricultural fields, on groundwater storage, groundwater levels, and potentially also stream flow. And so here, in this study, we used a model, the so-called C2VSIM model that was developed by the Department of Water Resources here in California. It's a finite element model that was developed for the Centro Valley. And we evaluated really different recharge scenarios, so different amounts. We played around with different recharge locations, which you can see in those plots here. These are the black hashed areas that you can see here. Just to see, you know, does it make a difference whether or not you keep most recharge in one area, or should you spread it out wherever you can? We also played around with different recharge timings. So should you recharge over longer or shorter period? And we also tested different diversion points just to see, you know, if you take out a lot of water from a river for recharge, how does it impact downstream flows? And, you know, I can talk an hour on this, on this topic alone, but the main take-home messages that I wanted to show you are, you can see here 4 plots, and these 4 plots correspond to these 4 diversion, recharge area scenarios, but we could, you know, we only need to really look at one because they all kind of look the same. You can see here in blue the amount of surface water that was diverted from the stream over time. The red line shows the groundwater storage gain over time. And the green line shows the return flow from the groundwater aquifer back into nearby streams over time. And so really what you can see here is as you're starting your recharge program, you know, let's say you recharge a certain amount every year for several decades. At the beginning, the groundwater storage gain is high because you have a lot of room in that aquifer to put water. So really that dominates in the first 2 decades, but it levels off over time. So you can see how the red line is leveling off. And so it really indicates that the groundwater system finds a new dynamic equilibrium over time. And at some point you can see that whatever water you put into that system, it will just go more or less straight into the, back into the river somewhere downstream. And that's here the green line that we can see. So, so really, you know, only really depleted groundwater aquifers will immediately see a huge groundwater storage gain, but over time you also see benefits for in-stream flows or aquatic ecosystems. And we can also see long-term effects. So by doing recharge, for example, we can see that your aquifer becomes more resilient to certain climate events. So here you can see, for example, the water table, so the stream stage of one of the rivers in the model. We had 2 bad droughts in the past, so the 76-77 drought and the early 90s drought in California. And so base case scenario in red, the recharge scenario in blue. And we could definitely see that the that when you're diverting water, of course, in a drought year and you're taking out huge amounts of water, you will negatively impact your in-stream flow even more so than just would typically occur during you know, a normal situation. But overall, we definitely can see that it elevates the stream flow in the long term in those rivers. And yeah, and since we were more interested in just learning really where exactly the water is going in the subsurface and how the recharge is happening in the subsurface, I wanted to also show you some results from Stephen Maples, a recent graduate PhD student here with Graham Fogg. And he used a par flow model to simulate a groundwater basin here, the American basin, just south of Sacramento. And here he looked at 5 scenarios. So he identified 5 recharge sites, which you can see in this plot here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each recharge site was placed in a different hydrophasia. So you can see here gravels in red, sands in yellow, muddy sand in green, and mud, which are definitely more fine textured soils, more clay-rich, silt-rich sediments in blue. And so he really showed that it matters quite a bit whether or not your recharge site is overlaying a fine textured hydrophases or a sand and gravel, because sand and gravels typically have higher infiltration rates, but they also have the benefit, particularly in semi-confined aquifers, that you would see a larger or wide-reaching immediate change in the pressure head. So as you're your semi-confined aquifer is a system that is under pressure. So it's not at atmospheric pressure. So if you're adding water to a semi-confined pressurized aquifer, it immediately creates a pressure wave that is propagating in the system that can have a positive effect immediately on your water table that you measure in the well. And so the simulation that you can see here is as we add 10 centimeter of recharge over 1,400 acres of an area, you see a 200 up to 200 meter vertical pressure propagation and up to 5 kilometers in the lateral dimension. We also see a groundwater storage gain, an immediate one from this recharge, which is 65 times greater in the gravel or sand hydrophaseous than it is in a mud or clay facies. Okay, moving on here. I wanted to show you some of the decision support tools that we have developed to aid growers in the decision making on where to do recharge. So one of the tools that has received quite a bit of attention here in the state among growers and also just state agency staff is the Soil Aquaculture Groundwater Banking Index, short SAGB. You might have heard about it. It's a tool that was developed by my colleague, soil specialist Toby O'Gene. He's an extension specialist here in LAWR. And he just used the soil survey data, so soil survey data, and particularly 5 major factors that you can see listed here to come up with a soil suitability index for groundwater recharge. So in easy terms, identifying which soils can, which soils are low or high permeability, which soils can infiltrate and transmit water quite quickly versus, other soils that might be less suitable and might create waterlogged conditions in the root zone that might harm crops. He created this this tool as an online web page. So if you just Google SAGB, you will find it fairly quickly. It's a very interactive tool. You can see the different ranked classes, soil classes here. There's 6 total, ranging from excellent to very poor, excellent soil being in green. And you can, because it's based on a Google Map interface, you can also even enter an address, find your farm, click on one of these locations, and it will tell you what the rating is of that soil based on these 5 factors that we are using to identify suitability. One should keep in mind that this tool is only describing the suitability of the upper 6 feet of the subsurface. So soil, soils are rarely mapped beyond 2 meter depth. So it's really just like helpful if you, let's say, grow a certain crop, you're concerned about harming that crop. You just want to make sure that the profile is draining fairly quickly. That would be a good tool to use for that purpose. We have used the SAGB index and have combined it with other geospatial data in a multi-criteria decision analysis to actually recommend recharge locations that could provide multiple benefits. So benefits beyond just like increasing groundwater storage or raising water tables. So one issue, for example, that we have in the Central Valley is we have a lot of rural communities, private households that rely on groundwater for drinking water. And some of these communities really face challenges of drinking water supply, particularly during the drought. When water tables were dropping, many of these communities had wells that ran dry, or they face contaminated groundwater that exceeds certain contaminant levels that the state has implemented. So for these communities, we think that if we target recharge strategically so that clean water can infiltrate in the subsurface and then flow to these domestic groundwater wells. We could provide increased water security. We could potentially help with cleaning up some of the contamination that exists around those wells. And so we basically put a study together to see if we can identify those recommended locations around these rural communities in the southern Central Valley. And in this analysis, we combined various data sets. So for example, the soil suitability index, we combined land use data, we digitized surface water conveyance systems, so ditches, canals that were moving water to agricultural fields. We used our C2V model and did particle tracking to identify the source area for each domestic well in each community, and to see, okay, depending on the well depth, where would we have to place water in the upgradient landscape of that well, so that the water would then move to that well in that community. And you can see a little bit of picture here in the lower right. And we also looked into how vulnerable communities are if the groundwater supply is changing, using, for example, census data on poverty status, linguistic isolation, and educational attainment. Many of these communities have a high percentage of Hispanic or people from Central America. And so many of them speak mainly Spanish as their first language. And so here there is the perception that these communities are often less able to help themselves if they encounter a problem such as, a well that is running dry. So we were trying to draw a little bit attention to those problems too. The results from our analysis are again available as an online tool here shown at this webpage. And it shows basically, going back to this map here, it shows basically agricultural land parcels that are suitable for recharge from soils, land use, and connection to conveyance system perspective. So you can see here some of the conveyance systems in blue. These are all ditches or canals that move water from rivers or the Frienkon Canal into this area. And depending on what soil type and land use you have here, you can see that dark blue areas identify parcels that are better suited than the light blue areas. But this map only shows parcels that would, if you recharge on those parcels, water would move into a downstream direction towards the community well or groundwater well in that community. So I'm at 50 minutes right now, roughly. I have, let's see, I have two more. I could skip over those slides and just go straight to my conclusions here. Yeah, so you've seen, on-farm recharge really has a large potential to address many problems that we're grappling with respect to, climate change impacts, water supply insecurities, particularly, the huge variability in precipitation that we see, which translates into huge variability in surface water supply. So we really think that it might be a good options in regions where we have large amounts of excess water that is less frequently available. In California, most water districts, surface water districts, have designated recharge basins. But during years such as 2017, all of these basins were full, and then they were looking for solutions to take extra water and recharge that also into the ground. And this is where using agricultural fields might be a key solution to provide acreage that really can be used to flood large amounts of water and put it underground. Our modeling has shown that recharge, particularly if you do it quite frequently over several years, can increase groundwater storage and can help with increasing return flows to streams, which can have positive side effects, particularly during the summer period when we have drought flows and we struggle with minimum flow, environmental flow requirements. Our modeling has also shown that targeted recharge near rural communities that are vulnerable to groundwater shortage might potentially be a way to increase climate resilience, to potentially improve water quality as well as water supply security by raising the water table in those communities. And our, I guess, cautionary note is many of these, particularly the modeling and decision support tool analyses, they should be definitely field validated before implementing a MAR project. Soil survey data, some of the data has been collected several decades ago and might not be absolutely accurate or representative of current conditions. So we definitely recommend always checking on site what the suitability is, and just to make sure, what's the nitrate load in that soil, or what are infiltration rates, to make sure that you're not creating any adverse effects. And with that, I would like to thank my students and postdocs and my many collaborators and our many sponsors, which really have been a huge help in getting some of this research done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helen. We have some questions, but according to the program, we will wait for the other two presentations, and then we will get all the questions. I will change the language to Spanish to continue with the presentation, but you can get the interpretation to follow the other two presentations.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Hola, ¿cómo están todos? Muy buenas tardes. Voy a prender la pantalla. Mi nombre es José Luis Arumí, yo soy profesor de la Universidad de Concepción, investigador principal del Centro Fondaprian y profesor del Departamento de Recursos Hídricos de la Universidad de Concepción. Me ha tocado moderar este webinar y siguiendo el programa vamos a dejar las preguntas que hay en el panel de preguntas y respuestas para más adelante, y vamos a seguir ahora con el panel de, dame un segundo para no equivocarme, con la exposición del secretario ejecutivo de la Comisión Nacional de Riego, el señor Federico Russell.
Hola, José Luis, muchas gracias. Buenas tardes a todos los que nos están viendo. Primero quería comenzar por agradecerle a la profesora Helen Dahlke por lo que nos acaba de mostrar, todo lo que están haciendo en California. La verdad es que nos produce un poco de envidia ver cómo están buscando distintas formas de recarga, porque nosotros aquí estamos un poco, algunos años atrasados en esta disciplina. En lo que sí nos podríamos parecer a California es que frente a la menor disponibilidad de agua, en Chile también hemos visto menor disponibilidad de agua superficial, producto de las lluvias, de la sequía, que para ninguno de los participantes es un misterio. Chile también se ha vuelto fuertemente al uso de los acuíferos como fuente de agua. Y eso nos plantea desafíos distintos que los desafíos a los que estábamos acostumbrados con las aguas superficiales. A mi juicio hay dos desafíos muy importantes que tenemos que abordar para hacer un uso más intenso de nuestras aguas subterráneas. Primero es la visión comunitaria que hay que tener sobre el recurso, y segundo, cómo hacemos que este recurso sea sostenible en el tiempo, cómo hacemos un uso sostenible de él. El primer desafío de visión comunitaria surge porque la mayoría de los pozos en Chile son de uso individual. Es una empresa, una sanitaria, un agricultor quien lo usa, y no hay en forma natural una lógica de uso común, como sí la hay en los canales, donde muchos usuarios sacan agua de un mismo canal. Y si hay escasez, bueno, la alícuota corre para todos. En los pozos no es así, hay un desafío importante ahí. Y el desafío de sostenibilidad, a mi juicio, surge porque nos cuesta dimensionar en qué condición se encuentra nuestra fuente de agua cuando esta es un acuífero, porque no lo vemos. No tenemos suficiente información, no conocemos su dinámica, cómo se recarga, a qué velocidad se mueven. Nos falta mucha información y tampoco tenemos muchas veces la cantidad de pozos, la explotación que está teniendo. En todo este escenario, como Ministerio de Agricultura y especialmente nosotros como Comisión Nacional de Riego, hemos trabajado en estos desafíos con varias propuestas que enmarcamos dentro de una publicación, un plan que hicimos en 2019, llamado Plan Nacional de Recarga de Acuíferos para la Agricultura. Y en este plan, una línea de trabajo muy importante es precisamente lo que se está haciendo hoy día, y agradecemos a UC Davis por la oportunidad, que es difusión y apoyo a las técnicas de recarga de acuíferos gestionadas. Otras medidas que nosotros hemos hecho para igual que UC Davis, difundir estas tecnologías o estas técnicas, les queremos contar algunas. Por ejemplo, preparamos unas guías metodológicas para la recarga de acuíferos gestionada. Estas guías fueron preparadas por UC Davis con Centro de Australia, dos referentes mundiales en este tema, y constituyen un elemento práctico que la Comisión Nacional de Riego entrega a los agricultores y a cualquier persona que esté interesada para facilitar el primer paso en la recarga de acuífero gestionada, que creemos que es algo que de todas maneras tenemos que abordar. Estas guías están publicadas, son gratuitas, por supuesto, y encontrarán distintos tipos de obras de recarga, esquemas de paso a paso, algunos costos, las dimensiones, y como digo, el objetivo es motivar y facilitar que los interesados planifiquen obras de recarga desde una perspectiva comunitaria, avanzando en la sustentabilidad del uso de este recurso. También hemos desarrollado algunos estudios interesantes. Hicimos un piloto de recarga en Cachapoal, que busca, mediante una experiencia práctica de construcción de piscinas de recarga, conocer cómo funciona, cómo operar este sistema, cómo medirlo. Algunos resultados de este estudio que pudimos probar en este invierno, en el invierno de este año, fue, por ejemplo, tuvimos una recarga de 41 litros por segundo, más o menos, promedio, durante 77 días en que dispusimos de agua para poder recargar. Y eso ya nos motiva a ver que en ese periodo logramos acumular 270.000 metros cúbicos a un costo de inversión bastante bajo. Las piscinas que construimos costaron alrededor de 40 millones de pesos, principalmente en movimiento de tierra. También estamos desarrollando un estudio de recarga en canales gracias a la experiencia que ya han tenido, ¿no?, en el canal Laja de Guillín, y ahí estamos desarrollando un estudio que parte este invierno y esperamos estar terminando en julio del 2022, y buscamos entender cómo medir la recarga en los canales, cómo trabajar en una metodología, una propuesta de operación de apertura y cierre de las compuertas para gestionar la recarga, crear perfiles de proyectos que incorporen la recarga como un objetivo adicional, no solo el riego, sino que sean doble propósito, todo en ese sentido, y todo lo necesario para plantear un sistema de recarga en canales que suele ser muy eficiente porque la infraestructura ya está. A este plan de recarga de acuíferos que hemos desarrollado, sumamos otras iniciativas, como algunas circulares que la DGA en algunas mesas de conversación emitió finalmente, y que nos permiten facilitar la construcción de obras de recarga superficial, o los pilotos de recarga que se están haciendo por parte de la Dirección de Obras Hidráulicas en Aconcagua, los primeros concursos de la Ley 18450 para obras de recarga y otras iniciativas de estudio. No hemos innovado tanto como la valiosa experiencia que nos acaban de mostrar en California de recarga en suelos cultivados. Creo que todavía nos queda algo de recorrido antes de llegar a eso, pero claramente surge como algo interesante. Y todo esto lo hacemos porque creemos que en Chile es necesario comenzar a recargar nuestro acuífero de manera gestionada desde ya. Esta es una práctica que en el mundo tiene muchos años, en Chile no ha sido requerida y ha sido poco utilizada, salvo algunas honrosas excepciones, como lo que ha hecho el canal Maipo, lo que ha hecho la tercera sección de la Concagua, o lo mismo que ha hecho el canal Laja de Guillín. Y junto a eso, como les mencionaba al principio, nosotros vemos otro desafío muy importante, que es la formación de comunidades de agua subterránea. En todas las cuencas donde haya pozos abundantes, donde muchos de los agricultores usen pozos, es importante formar comunidades de agua subterránea. La falta de organizaciones de usuarios de agua, en nuestra experiencia, es una causa de conflictividad frente a la escasez. Cuando falta el agua y no hay quien la gestione, se produce conflicto. Más aún ocurre en las aguas subterráneas, que como decía antes, no vemos la fuente, no estamos claros de si se está agotando para todos de la misma manera o no, hay pozos a distintas profundidades, por lo tanto unos afectan antes que otros, y ahí estamos convencidos que nadie administra el agua mejor que los propios usuarios, organizados, participando activamente en sus distintas organizaciones de usuarios de agua, y en este sentido las comunidades de agua subterránea que existen en el código desde su origen, están muy atrasadas también. Necesitamos esta organización que empiece a velar por el recurso común del acuífero. Y en ese sentido, como Comisión Nacional de Riego, también hemos tratado de apoyar con todas nuestras fuerzas a las comunidades de agua subterránea que ya existen en el país, como las de Copiapó y las de Ligua Petorca, que son las principales, las más organizadas hasta ahora, y estamos apoyando la constitución de nuevas comunidades de agua subterránea en Azapa, en Pica, en Aconcagua. Prontamente esperamos ayudar con un convenio regional en O'Higgins, y también en algunas de las juntas de vigilancia que estamos empujando y ayudando a constituirse, que estamos pidiendo que se incorpore el concepto de agua subterránea dentro del alcance de la Junta. Así es que eso les quería contar. Como Comisión Nacional de Riego estamos muy, muy orgullosos y muy expectantes de poder ayudar al país con esta iniciativa, de hacer una contribución, y ahora el desafío es más bien de los agricultores y de todos quienes administran directamente el agua, de todos los usuarios de agua, de hacer un uso más sustentable de nuestros acuíferos, usándolos de manera que nos permitan paliar la sequía cuando nos falte el agua, pero devolverles la mano a través de la recarga de acuíferos gestionada en los periodos de mayor abundancia. Eso, José Luis, es lo que yo quería contarles a todos como presentación de la comisión.
Muchas gracias, Federico. Hay un par de preguntas más, pero tal como dije recién, vamos a esperar la intervención de don Oscar Cristi, director general de Agua. Oscar.
¿Sí me escuchan? Y
Sí,
me
fuerte y
ven.
claro.
Y me ven, ¿no? Gracias. Gracias, José Luis. Sí, mira, primero felicitar al equipo de universidades y a ustedes por adjudicarse este proyecto de Corfo que hemos venido trabajando junto a Corfo, el Ministerio de Ciencia, la Dirección General de Agua, con muchísimo interés porque aborda varias materias que son extraordinariamente relevantes para la Dirección General de Agua, sobre todo una que tiene que ver con la generación de información, la forma de trabajar la información hídrica, la forma de entregar y dejar disponible la información para la toma de decisiones. Es un tema muy, muy relevante y tenemos mucha esperanza en lo que pueda salir de este trabajo. Así que felicitaciones al equipo que se lo adjudicó y cuenten con todo el apoyo, todo el soporte de la Dirección General de Agua para poder llegar a buen término con este proyecto. También como se ha mencionado y como lo decía Federico hace un momento, Chile viene pasando por un largo periodo de desbalance entre oferta y demanda, por una sequía ya bastante prolongada, y eso se está traduciendo a nivel de país en una necesidad de, por un lado, eficientar la demanda y por otro lado, mejorar la oferta. Para poner algunos números, el balance hídrico nacional que se acaba de terminar para Chile, y que proyecta la situación del país en un escenario de cambio climático para el periodo 2030-2060, nos está dando que se proyecta un déficit de aproximadamente 550 metros cúbicos por segundo, concentrado en 5 regiones del país: Tarapacá, Antofagasta, Atacama, Coquimbo y Valparaíso, siendo Coquimbo la que presenta el mayor déficit proyectado. En el escenario anterior, las proyecciones que existían en el 2015 mostraban un desbalance bastante menor y que abarcaba solo 3 regiones. Entonces, esto nos supone un desafío de cómo enfrentar este desbalance entre disponibilidad y demanda. Y ahí sin duda que uno de los temas es la inversión en infraestructura, pero también la gestión. Y para la gestión vemos 2 elementos que son claves. Uno, mejorar la información, y segundo, todo lo que tiene que ver con la planificación a nivel de cuenca, entendiendo la cuenca como la unidad básica donde gestionar y planificar el desarrollo del recurso hídrico. En esa línea, la DGA viene haciendo varios esfuerzos. Uno de ellos es justamente la actualización del balance hídrico nacional para tener una mejor idea de dónde están las mayores necesidades de gestión. Segundo, un esfuerzo que hemos comenzado este año muy importante para poder comenzar a monitorear las extracciones efectivas de agua. Las extracciones efectivas desde cada pozo autorizado y las extracciones efectivas desde cada bocatoma. Esto va a ser muy, muy importante porque nos va a permitir actualizar en forma periódica cuáles son las demandas. Muchas veces cuando analizamos el tema agua en Chile, cuando analizamos el tema de gestión, utilizamos los derechos como sinónimo de demanda efectiva. Y la verdad es que eso es un error porque los números que tenemos nos muestran que en promedio en el país los derechos son hasta 20 veces más que la cantidad que efectivamente se extrae. O en otras palabras, los derechos están siendo nominales en parte importante y solo están permitiendo captar una fracción reducida de lo que dice el papel, lo que dice el derecho que te otorgaron o que adquiriste en el mercado. Entonces, las estimaciones de demanda, de consumo en base a derechos están siendo muy imperfectas, y esta información que vamos a generar a partir de las extracciones efectivas en forma periódica va a permitir tener entonces un conocimiento cabal de la demanda, el consumo, para efectos de estudios, para efectos de balance y también, por supuesto, para efectos de fiscalización. Este es un desafío enorme porque son miles de pozos en el país, miles de derechos de aguas subterráneas y también miles de las bocatomas que existen en el país, pero ya hemos comenzado en las regiones más conflictivas, donde hay más déficit de agua, como Aconcagua, como algunas regiones del norte, y ya estamos comenzando a recibir la primera información de extracciones, en el caso de las mayores extracciones, los pozos, las bocatomas, los pozos principales. Esa información se envía en línea a la Dirección General de Agua. Los pozos más pequeños tienen un sistema un poquito más simple de enviar la información, pero al cabo de cuentas vamos a poder contar con información muy importante y muy útil para la gestión. Y lo segundo que estamos haciendo también en la Dirección General de Agua es todo un trabajo de planificación a nivel de cuenca, de planes de gestión estratégica por cuenca, que era algo que se venía haciendo en el pasado, pero en forma no continua, no en forma homogénea. Ahora nos hemos planteado un desafío enorme de que de aquí al año 2022 podamos tener y podamos contar con un plan específico de gestión para cada una de las 52 cuencas más importantes del país. En el país son 101 cuencas y hay 52 que hemos privilegiado en este primer esfuerzo. Luego continuaremos hasta llegar a las 101 cuencas, pero ya este desafío de contar con la planificación en 52 cuencas es un enorme desafío. Ya este año estamos recibiendo los 10 primeros planes, el próximo año vamos a recibir otros 20 y así hasta 52 cuencas. Y estos planes tienen como punto de partida una modelación hidrológica conjunta de agua subterránea y superficial. Por tanto, son planes que parten con enfoque de gestión integrada de recursos superficial y subterráneo. ¿Qué nos va a permitir eso? Nos va a permitir un conocimiento cabal de los acuíferos, de la disponibilidad de agua subterránea, de su comportamiento, pieza clave y fundamental para poder impulsar un plan de recarga de acuíferos. También nos van a señalar estos planes, y nos están señalando cuáles son las necesidades futuras y cuáles pueden ser las distintas alternativas de nuevas fuentes. Y entre esas nuevas fuentes ya tenemos algunas cifras globales que han sido desarrolladas por Corfo, justamente en otros proyectos, que muestran, por ejemplo, que la principal fuente de agua que podemos visualizar en el corto plazo es justamente una mejora en la eficiencia de riego. Una eficiencia de riego, una mejora de aproximadamente un 5% de la eficiencia de riego, nos podría estar aportando unos 30 metros cúbicos por segundo, que es bastante similar a el aporte que está previsto para un listado de casi 26 embalses que están en distintas etapas de estudio, de ejecución, de licitación, que constituyen la propuesta de generación de embalses para los próximos años, pero la eficiencia de riego está siendo incluso más importante que el aporte de esos embalses, con la dificultad adicional de que esos embalses tardan muchísimos años en desarrollarse y tienen una serie de problemas. En Chile un embalse no se construye antes de 30 años. Entonces, la mirada que ya estamos obteniendo desde esta planificación es la necesidad de impulsar la eficiencia de riego. Luego están las alternativas de desalinización de agua de mar, que en una mirada ambiciosa podemos aspirar a desarrollar fuentes por unos 10 metros cúbicos por segundo en los próximos años, pero que tiene la limitante de que son fuentes de agua principalmente para el consumo humano y por los costos que ello conlleva, los precios por metro cúbico son todavía muy prohibitivos para la agricultura. Por tanto, quizás la limitante ahí no va a ser la capacidad de generar estas plantas, sino que va a ser la limitante por ahora de quién está en condiciones de pagar el costo de esa agua desalada. También tenemos como otras fuentes que están apareciendo en esta planificación el reuso de agua servida, que son estimaciones que van desde los 9 metros cúbicos por segundo hasta otras más ambiciosas de 20 metros cúbicos por segundo, que se podrían agregar a la oferta nacional. Y proyectos ya mucho más complejos son los que aparecen como los trasvases de agua desde unas cuencas a otras, que podrían ser un gran aporte, pero que prevemos que van a ser muy difíciles de implementar en el corto o mediano plazo. Y aquí aparece entonces como una alternativa poco desarrollada y poco explotada y poco mirada, diría yo, que es la recarga artificial de acuíferos, que de hecho no la nombré en ninguna de las alternativas que hemos estado barajando y mirando, por razones que Federico señalaba, que nos hemos ido quedando atrás en esta práctica. No obstante, las aguas subterráneas son cada vez más importantes. En términos de recarga, tenemos en el país un número muy limitado de iniciativas que tienen casi en todos los lugares un carácter más bien de piloto, de prueba, de estudio, de análisis, de desarrollo de experiencia, pero no es algo que tengamos desarrollado en forma masiva como debe ser, sobre todo cuando hay estudios previos que indican que hay muchos lugares donde hay escasez importante de agua, con muy buenas condiciones para la recarga de acuíferos. La misma Comisión Nacional de Riego mapeó una serie de regiones, y en regiones tan complicadas como la región de Valparaíso en el país, donde hay mucha escasez de agua, se dan extraordinarias condiciones para la recarga de acuíferos, lo mismo en otras zonas del norte, y así hasta la Araucanía. Hay importantes áreas donde las condiciones permitirían una buena recarga, y lo que está faltando, diría que son dos cosas. Uno, el conocimiento de los acuíferos para determinar qué pasaría con esa recarga, hacia dónde serían los flujos, cómo se podrían recuperar, y eso lo estamos subsanando con esta modelación que les contaba a través de la planificación. Segundo aspecto, un tema normativo. Nuestro Código de Aguas, que está en proceso de reforma, es un código de aguas principalmente pensado en el agua superficial y poco en el agua subterránea, y menos en la recarga de acuíferos. Por tanto, las normas que aparecen ahí sobre recarga de acuíferos son muy limitadas, y no creo, y a parecer nuestro, no están generando los incentivos necesarios para impulsar una recarga de acuíferos relevante en el país. Como Dirección General de Agua hemos ido sacando algunas resoluciones en el último tiempo, pensando básicamente en la recarga que hacen muchos de los canales existentes en el país que transportan agua. Son canales que no tienen revestimiento y que por tanto, en la medida que esos canales lleven agua, van recargando los acuíferos, permitiendo, por ejemplo, que esos canales sigan funcionando en invierno, cosa que no estaba permitido antes por razones de seguridad. Ahora que las seguridades y la forma de teledetección y telemedición han ido mejorando, la seguridad es más fácil de mantener, esos canales funcionando en invierno, y eso están recargando acuíferos. En fin, hemos ido buscando algunas alternativas para estas recargas, pero aún tenemos un desafío normativo relevante. Y en tercer lugar, no hemos sido capaces de desarrollar las condiciones para que se generen modelos de negocios que permitan una expansión importante de la recarga de acuíferos en el país. El Estado tiene recursos limitados, y es poco lo que puede hacer el Estado en términos de inversión para impulsar definitivamente esta recarga. Aquí necesitamos la participación del sector privado, necesitamos emprendedores, empresarios que quieran volcarse a esta actividad, y para eso tenemos que pensar, impulsar cuál puede ser un modelo de negocio que permita a empresarios invertir en esta área. Y aquí, claro, obviamente el tema de las externalidades asociadas a un proceso de recarga artificial es uno de los temas que hay que resolver, entre otros, los precios, etcétera, para que esos incentivos existan y podamos entonces impulsar definitivamente impulsar al sector privado para que avance en recarga de acuíferos. Eso sería, José Luis, algunas de las ideas que tenía en mente. Creo que dejo hasta aquí porque ya se ha ido alargando. Entiendo que hay una hora de término, así que mejor para las consultas.
Ok, muchas gracias, Oscar. Tengo un grupo de consultas. Claro, aquí me llega por interno un recordatorio, por favor, que abajo, en el menú de abajo, hay un banner que dice pregunta y respuesta, o en inglés. Ahí pueden hacer las preguntas. Yo las voy a ir leyendo. Voy a tratar de ir tomándolas por los grandes temas. Evidentemente, y como es lógico, la mayoría de las preguntas son para Helen, pero también hay un par de preguntas hacia Oscar y a Federico. Voy a partir con una pregunta que hace el señor Víctor Zúñiga, quien quiero destacar es el gerente de la empresa con Potencial Consultores, que es la empresa que está llevando dos proyectos que mencionó el secretario ejecutivo de la CNR en Cachapoal y en el río de Guillén. Entonces, Helen, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned about the risk that the farmer assume regarding the use of flat groundwater recharge or manager groundwater recharge. So how people understand the risk, and if the farmer, what they think about the risk, if they are willing to take that risk, or in some way there is some kind of there is another question related to that. There is some kind of incentive to the farmer to take the risk. So that is the first question about what is the relationship between the farmer and the risk.
Yeah, that's a good question. So some of the tools that I had presented is trying to help with this, with estimating the risk on the farmer side. So it will still probably take several years until we have more studies on various crops and how they respond to flooded conditions in the winter. But that SAGB tool, so the Soil Suitability Index for recharge, is definitely one tool that has really caught on because it provides some guidance on whether or not a soil can pass water fairly quickly or not. And a lot of farmers have used this already to make the decision, you know, is this something they can do on their land or not? As for the willingness to do this and the need for incentives, this question is coming up quite frequently, and I also get that from growers directly. So far, the state has not provided any financial assistance directly to farmers that flood their fields for recharge. But I know that some of the water districts that have started implementing this form of managed aquifer recharge within their jurisdiction, they have developed incentive programs, and they might not maybe look like, you know, you get a check written and you get, or some cash payment. They work a little bit more like the net metering system that we have in the United States. So you typically get credit for the water that you are recharging, and it might look like that, you know, your water bill is a little bit cheaper in the summer when you are actually requesting water from the district. Or they, in some cases, I definitely know they have actually paid farmers $150 or up to $250 per acre if they have done recharge on their land. So it really depends, you know, from district to district, what their budget is, what their business model looks like. But there is no top-down, state-guided economic program that really supports that. So most of that has been developed from the bottom up and might be locally different. Yeah. And I think I saw a question in here also, you know, what might be the incentive for a small farmer who does not have necessarily, you know, a big farm business. So the one I would say somewhat surprising finding is actually that there are farmers or farm businesses in California who will do that no matter what. They don't expect payment for the recharge because they just see the benefit in the long term that they might receive from implementing this practice. So going back to Don Cameron from Terra Nova Ranch, he is a grower who does not get surface water delivered from a surface water district. He only has groundwater to pump to grow his crops. So any excess water he can get his hands on, he will take, and he put that on his fields no matter what. He does not care about, you know, whether or not it will harm his crops, because for him it's more important that he will stay in business in 10 or 50 years than potentially losing the crop in one growing season. He's in a part of the Central Valley where we see floodwater maybe every 5 to 7 years. So for him, you know, he rather wants to bank that water when it's coming than losing that crop for that 1 year. He can definitely swallow that loss. And he's one of the farmers who just invested $12 million into building out a fairly extensive infrastructure on his farm so he can pump 500 CFS, cubic feet per second, of flood water when it's available onto his farm and recharge it on various fields.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I get the information that Dr. Oscar Christie, he needs to go to another meeting pretty soon. So I will have the opportunity to say thank you. Sorry, I'm speaking in English. Oh, me acaban de avisar por interno, perdonen, esto pasa bastante seguido, que el doctor Oscar Christie tiene una reunión ahora a las 6:30, así que quiero aprovechar de despedir y agradecer su participación. Hay un par de preguntas hacia la DGA, pero estamos muy sobre la marcha. Básicamente, Oscar se refiere a cómo se administraría en el caso de cuando la recarga proviene de aguas superficiales, de ríos, por ejemplo, cómo se ha pensado la administración de los derechos de agua. Eso, no sé si tiene tiempo.
Sí, no, sí, encantado. Mira, sí, estaba leyendo todas las preguntas de aquí. Son súper interesantes las preguntas y son muy atingentes. Y voy a mencionar rápidamente un mini comentario, después podemos... Uno pregunta cómo el trade-off entre eficiencia y recarga de acuíferos, ¿eh? Si hay más eficiencia y menos recarga. Es un tema interesante. Yo creo que hay que tener en cuenta la dimensión temporal, es decir, que la recarga debe producirse principalmente en las temporadas de no riego. Y después viene justamente, bueno, ¿y de dónde sale el agua? Evidentemente, la mayor parte de la recarga va a provenir de los ríos. Y para tomar esa agua hay que tener derechos de agua. Entonces, la verdad es que la recarga debiese provenir de aquellos momentos en que el río llevaba agua y no se está utilizando en forma importante, y podamos tomar entonces agua del río con derechos para poder hacer la recarga. Ahora, que el agua infiltrada, que sobre el agua infiltrada se generen nuevos derechos, creo que es más complicado, porque estaríamos generando dobles derechos sobre una misma agua. Es decir, el agua que yo tomo del río, sobre la cual tengo derecho, la almaceno en el acuífero para utilizarla más adelante. No hace sentido que uno genere un nuevo derecho sobre agua subterránea, porque ya hay derechos constituidos sobre esa agua. Yo veo más bien el tema de la recarga acuífera como un sistema de almacenamiento de agua que se alimenta en los periodos de no riego para poder después utilizar en los periodos de mayor demanda. Y por tanto veo el problema como un problema de almacenamiento y optimización del almacenamiento de las aguas. Alguien pregunta, entonces la idea sería sacar todo el agua del río. Bueno, desconozco porque va a depender de la capacidad del acuífero para la recarga, pero si llegara a ser extremadamente importante, llegara a ser el extremo de que hay capacidad para tomar todo el agua del río y recargarla, creo que ahí lo que hay que salvaguardar son los caudales ecológicos, ¿no? Y eso requeriría un trabajo mucho más certero que el que hacemos hoy en la actualidad, porque hoy día constituimos caudal ecológico, pero no hay un control, no hay una medición respecto a esos caudales ecológicos. Entonces, aquí creo que el que pregunta plantea un desafío muy importante, es decir, cómo, sacar el agua del río para recarga, pero cómo asegurar que el caudal ecológico se mantenga, cómo monitorearlo, cómo controlarlo. Y por último, hacen una pregunta respecto a si aquí vamos a tener en aguas subterráneas un sobretratamiento como en aguas superficiales. Bueno, la verdad es que ya existe en bastantes cuencas, y la DGA varias veces en varios acuíferos, hay un sobreotorgamiento de derechos. Si tomamos los derechos nominales, es decir, me refiero a lo que el certificado señala, o la inscripción del conservador de bienes raíces señala, y lo comparamos con la recarga, vemos que en muchos casos sí hay un sobreotorgamiento. Ahora, la pregunta es, son varias. Uno, ese sobreotorgamiento implica sobreexplotación. Creo que ahí es una pregunta distinta, porque la verdad es que yo puedo tener un derecho de agua subterránea por 10 litros por segundo, pero solo capto 3, porque un pozo está colgado, porque no tengo acceso a más, y por tanto hay un salto entre comparar derechos con recarga a luego comparar extracción efectiva con recarga, tema que vamos a poder hacer justamente ahora a partir del monitoreo de extracciones efectivas. Y en aquellos casos en que hay sobreexplotación, una modificación de hace poco, del 2018, del Código de Agua, va a permitir a la Dirección General de Agua, en aquellos casos que demuestren, en base al monitoreo, que hay una sobreexplotación del acuífero, es decir, que se está sacando efectivamente más que la recarga, va a permitir a la DGA aplicar prorrata. De oficio, la DGA va a poder exigir la reducción en las extracciones. Y todos estos planes de cuenca que mencioné hace algún momento tienen justamente en uno de sus capítulos una evaluación del acuífero para señalar si es necesario o no aplicar una reducción de extracciones, en qué periodo, a qué tasa y quiénes serían los afectados, con la idea de recuperar los acuíferos. Pero también es muy importante en esto de la sobreexplotación que cuando ocurra hay que hacer prorrata, como se hace en las aguas superficiales. Si hay menos agua, se distribuye proporcionalmente, son acciones, en ese sentido son proporcionales, y lo mismo debe ocurrir en las aguas subterráneas, pero para eso es fundamental que existan las comunidades de aguas subterráneas, que son las que podrían establecer esta prorrata en las extracciones para cuidar los acuíferos cuando están sobreexplotados. Pero nuevamente eso requiere un monitoreo exacto de cuánto saca cada pozo para poder llevar un control. O sea, hay, interesantísimas preguntas, ¿eh? Es un tema de enorme desafío que hay mucho por pensarse y por hacer, y me encantaría poder seguir intercambiando a ustedes, pero tengo una reunión justamente con una sanitaria, un problema de distribución de agua importante en el norte del país. Así que te agradezco, José Luis, la invitación, agradezco a UC Davis y vuelvo a felicitar a todas las personas que han hecho suyo este concurso del consorcio, y espero que nos sigamos viendo para ir monitoreando, ir apoyando en el trabajo que van a hacer en ese consorcio.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Muy gracias por tu participación. Bueno, muchas gracias y hasta luego.
Chao, estén bien.
Tengo una pregunta más para Helen y después para Federico. Voy a partir volver con Helen. Hay una pregunta sobre el tema del manejo en nitrógeno y quiero extenderlo un poco más hacia la parte de calidad de agua. Entonces, Helen, regarding nitrate manager or nitrogen manager, was there any nitrogen input in the water being flowed? And also I would add, how did you control the quality of the water? Because this is a big concern.
Yeah. So most of the on-farm or, AgMar studies that we conducted, or, that we would like the farmers see implemented, would use excess surface water. And by that, I mean, those are flood flows, or, these flows when the rivers are swelling from big rainstorm events. So most of the water, most of the stream flow we get in the Central Valley would come, of course, from the surrounding mountains. So the Sierra Nevada mountains, for example. So most of that water is actually, direct rainfall runoff or snow melt. And that water is pretty clean, like really, to the extent when growers get that water for normal irrigation during the growing season, I've heard they mix it with groundwater because it's not infiltrating very well because of the low mineral content. So using that water, definitely, that one carries very low nitrate concentration. So there's not really a concern that we're introducing more nitrate from that water. Some of the experiments we have conducted, we have used pumped groundwater because we can't wait 5 years until a wet year comes around. So, you know, funding agencies often only support 3 years of research. And if you don't get a wet year in that time, you know, you can't say, I'm sorry, I used all the money, but I can't present any results. So in that case, some of the farmers have pumped groundwater for us, and those can definitely contain nitrate. So we incorporated that in the results. Some of the sites we had 9 ppm, 9, 12 ppm of nitrate in the groundwater, which is definitely around the maximum contaminant level that we have here in California. So, but in general, this is what we mean by clean recharge. So using fairly clean snowmelt rainfall runoff from the Sierras does not really carry much nitrate or other chemicals. The one concern we do have is sediment. So a lot of the, you might be familiar with some of the groundwater banks we have in the state. They definitely do not take the early water, so the water that comes on the rising limb of your hydrograph, because it carries too much sediment. They typically let that go and wait until sediment concentrations have dropped to an acceptable level.
Okay. I have a question for, sorry, I have a question for Federico Errázuriz. I will say that in Spanish. Tengo una pregunta para el secretario ejecutivo que es básicamente una pregunta que ya respondió el doctor Oscar Christie en relación a su visión de la DGA, pero que se refiere a cómo se puede balancear, y es algo que lo hemos hablado muchas veces en distintos ámbitos, cómo se puede balancear las decisiones de aumentar la eficiencia en riego y la eficiencia de la recarga de acuíferos. Entonces, por ejemplo, el legítimo derecho de un agricultor de conducir su agua en un canal de riego versus a usar los canales de riego para recargar o varios casos más que se discuten. Entonces, quería saber la visión de Federico en ese sentido.
Gracias, José Luis. Yo creo que lo primero que hay que reconocer es que cuando el agua abundaba, podíamos permitirnos ciertas ineficiencias. Es decir, si el riego no era tan eficiente, igual alcanzaba para todos y para otros usos, y por lo tanto los canales no eran tan sellados, nadie revestía los canales y el agua infiltraba y había un equilibrio basado en la abundancia que no obligaba a la eficiencia. Ese escenario ha ido cambiando y yo creo que hoy día hay que hacer las dos cosas bien, hay que hacer las dos cosas de manera pensada. Ya no podemos dejar que la recarga ocurra solo naturalmente, ya sea en canales artificiales o en cauces naturales, pero que ocurra espontáneamente, sino que tenemos que gestionarla y hacerla. Y lo mismo con la tecnificación, tenemos que darle a la planta el agua que necesita y ojalá no más. Y en ese sentido, yo estoy de acuerdo con lo que dijo Oscar, que en Chile, dado nuestro clima, tenemos una abundancia de agua en invierno, que obviamente no es el periodo donde tenemos la mayor demanda, y tenemos una alta demanda en verano, cuando es el periodo en que tenemos la menor disponibilidad. Por lo tanto, yo creo que hay que hacer ambas cosas. Estoy de acuerdo que hay que balancearlas. No podemos irnos 100% a tecnificar todo y revestir el 100% de los canales y no hacernos cargo de lo que ello implica para los acuíferos. Pero hay que entender que en verano queremos que cada gota sea usada de la manera más eficiente, y en invierno, bueno, como acumulamos la mayor cantidad de agua en los acuíferos, permitiendo también que haya vertimiento al mar. Pero el desafío en el fondo es, ahora tenemos que hacer las dos cosas controladas y bien.
Muchas gracias, Federico. Tengo una última, dos preguntas para Helen. Voy a cambiar de idioma de nuevo, algunas veces me confundo, pero Helen, what are the infrastructure requirements needed to implement manager aquifer recharge? Sorry.
Yeah, that's also a good question. So infrastructure, we're talking about surface water conveyance systems like ditches, canals, etc. So the amounts that we are interested in recharging are often much greater than the amounts of water that we typically move around during the growing season for irrigation. So there is actually a very nice report by the Public Policy Institute of California, done by Ellen Hannock, that looked into this like infrastructure need and capacity that we have, and how we would have to change that for managed aquifer recharge. And that's definitely one of the bottlenecks that we need to tackle in the coming years. The current capacity is definitely not enough to convey the amounts that we are interested in recharging, particularly not if we want to address the 2 million acre feet of overdraft per year that we currently have. So I've seen that the federal government just recently released, I think, 80 million in funding to repair the Frying Current Canal, which has been pretty heavily impacted by land subsidence. So it lost quite a bit of its capacity, about halfway down. And so hopefully with that funding, we can improve the capacity to what it was when the canal was built. But each individual water district will most likely have to apply for federal grants or state grants to also expand their conveyance capacity if they really want to get serious about recharge.
Sorry, I have a last question to Helen. It's regarding the law and the strategic plan of California. And you mentioned about the law of the year 2014, who was mandated and what they were mandated. And also regarding the strategic plan, if that plan includes some kind of a restriction or prohibition about extraction.
Yeah, so the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, it was passed in September of 2014. And this was really a proposal that was pushed forward by certain state senators. It didn't really look like it was going to go through because no one really has touched groundwater in California for years. And in many ways, our groundwater rights are behind the rights that other states have already implemented. But yeah, it was proposed by a senator, and then they voted on it and it passed. So the senator, of course, was backed by several, coalitions that were pushing for this change. And yeah, I mean, we were all surprised and happy actually that it went through. And so if you actually look at the California code that surrounds Sigma, so the way it was implemented, they were encouraging a local action approach. So they were very much aware that this can be a top-down approach. Local stakeholders and water managers will have to come together and discuss and decide on how they want to manage their basins. But the State Water Board set a clear goal, and that was, you have to become sustainable over a 20-year horizon. And that means every groundwater basin, and we had to form these so-called groundwater sustainability agencies. They had to come up with a water budget. So, a lot of work in the past 2-3 years has focused on developing these water budgets for each groundwater subbasin, so that we can figure out, by how much would we have to reduce, for example, water use, pumping particularly, to come even. And so again, I can recommend reading one of the recent reports that the Public Policy Institute of California has published on this. So they've looked and reviewed many of these groundwater sustainability plans that were submitted in January of this year, particularly by agencies that are overlying the critically overdrafted groundwater basins. And it looks like that most of these plans plan to do managed aquifer recharge, and they think they can address 50%, about 50% of the overdraft by just recharging more water. It looks like if we are adding up all those volumes that they are expecting to recharge, doesn't look like we have enough water for that, or it's not feasible to do that because, you know, of capacity constraints. So, you know, those are just plans. So now we are entering in the implementation phase, and we have milestones. So every 5 years, each basin and each GSA has to evaluate again, okay, where are they? Have they made progress? And if they don't, they have some, you know, they have some flexibility to make corrections. But ultimately, if they're not achieving what they're set out to do, the State Water Board will come in and can take over the management. So there's definitely, you know, this like stick and carrot approach. The carrot right now is that we give local landowners a lot of flexibility to come up with their own solutions, but if they're not working, the state will come in and will definitely implement more strict or more drastic actions to get to the goal.
Okay, Helen, again, thank you very much for your participation and to accept to give us this very, very interesting talk. There is a lot of people watching that and many questions. And now I will change to Spanish again. Para ir cerrando, voy a dejar la palabra a Mauricio para que ir cerrando esta interesante presentación. Antes quiero agradecer a Federico, a Helen, su participación y al equipo que hizo esto posible. Muchas gracias a todos. Hasta
Gracias, José Luis. Thank you, Helen, for your presentation and sharing the knowledge and all the research and information that is going on in California. Quería solamente mencionar que muchos de la extension talk que hemos estado dando de UC Chile tienen que ver con el tema de agua, y esto tiene relación con los proyectos que estamos llevando, pero además con el interés que se ha generado por este tema. Muchas de las personas que incluso Helen mencionó en sus láminas al final de Acknowledge, es gente que ha estado presente en estos mismos talks. Sam Sandoval ya es casi speaker frecuente, ya que habla español además, lo hace más fácil también para la audiencia. Graham Fogg ha estado acá en Chile, Helen también ha estado en Chile. Muchos de los investigadores conocen la realidad chilena, es lo que queremos seguir compartiendo. Los temas regulatorios, a lo que hacía referencia José Luis también, el Sigma Act, también es uno de los temas muy interesantes que yo creo que podemos ir desarrollando en el futuro. Esto es una invitación a que nos comenten a través de nuestros canales formales en qué temáticas podríamos seguir también trabajando en esto. Invito también a la academia chilena a que nos pongan temas donde nosotros podamos apoyar con el conocimiento de California. Y bueno, a Federico y a Oscar también se lo dejamos. Se lo hemos dado ya como oferta, ahí estamos siempre para poder trabajar con ustedes. Ahora se lo digo a Federico directamente, ya que Oscar se fue, pero siempre lo ofrecemos a Oscar. Pero Federico también cuenta con UC Davis Chile para poder conectar de mejor forma con UC Davis en California y poder traer esta experiencia a un nivel de difusión, como lo estamos viendo ahora, que es importante, como bien tú lo mencionaste, Federico, pero además para reuniones más chicas, reuniones de discusión, donde podamos ir afinando detallitos, donde podamos trabajar en mesas técnicas en conjunto, completamente disponibles. Así que, bueno, ahí está la pantalla de fondo que dice que estas presentaciones están disponibles en nuestra página web. Esta y las anteriores están ahí, van a estar ahí. Así que cualquier cosa, ahí está el mail de nuestra coordinadora de extensión e innovación, Leticia Roja. Y bueno, me despido a nombre de UC Davis Chile y de UC Davis California. Gracias por su atención a todos los participantes y seguiremos en contacto. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you all.